In this video, I'm going to show you the technique of gathering, where a larger piece of fabric is gathered to fit to a smaller piece of fabric. This is quite commonly used across the waistline or bust line of garments, or it might be used on sleeves. It can also be used to add ruffles to dresses, or you can add ruffles to your homeware projects, such as cushions. Here, this longer piece of fabric is gathered and attached to a smaller piece. You'll see that the gathering is evenly distributed along the seam line. To create this sample, I'm using one smaller piece of fabric and a much longer piece of fabric. The smaller piece is approximately 8 inches or 20 centimetres long by 8 centimetres or 3 inches wide. This longer piece is double that size. When you're doing gathering, it's really useful to have some markings to help you place the two pieces of fabric together after you've gathered up the longer piece. So to do that, I like to fold my piece of fabric in half and just use a tiny snip to cut the centre point here, and then also to give you further reference points, fold the piece of fabric again and cut the quarter points. I'm only snipping about 1/2 centimetre or 1/4 of an inch into the fabric. Then repeat for the longer piece, making sure to cut into the top edge where you'll make the seam. So folding in half, marking the centre, folding again and marking the quarter mark. Now I've placed my markings, the next thing is to do 2 lines of long machine stitching or basting stitches along this top edge. I want my 2 lines of machine stitching to sit within the seam allowance, and for this project I'm using 1.5 centimetres or 5/8 of an inch for my seam allowance. So I'll place my 2 lines of long machine stitches less than that measurement from the edge. I'll show you how this is done on the sewing machine. On my needle plate, I've got a line marked here that's got a 15 through it. So this is my seam allowance line, and I want my long machine stitches to sit within that. So I'm going to use this line here at 1 centimetre to place my first line, and then I'll be using a marker halfway between the two at about 1.3 centimetres in order to do my second line of long machine stitches. I'm going to turn my stitch length up to 4 to give me the longest stitch. Place the fabric under the presser foot, using the centimetre line as a guide, and then just run a line of stitching without back tacking all the way to the other end. And when you reach the other end, lift up the presser foot and pull a long tail of thread, and then cut your threads. Pull the threads out a little before we start again, and then run another line of stitching, this time 1.3 centimetres or around 1/2 an inch from the edge of the fabric. Now you've worked your long machine stitches, we're going to gather up those threads. Turn the fabric over and separate the top threads from the bobbin threads. I find it's helpful to use a pin to just separate those threads, or you might wish to have done this in different colours. Then pull on the bobbin threads. I pull the bobbin threads because it's easier to pull the bobbin threads. They just move a bit more easily than the top threads. Start to bunch up the fabric. You can also pull from the other end if that helps. Once you think you've bunched the fabric up enough, take your smaller piece of fabric and see if that's going to fit. So you can see I've actually gathered a little bit too much, but that's okay. Then take your pins. We'll start to match the snips and the ends of the fabric together. So I'll begin by matching this edge with this end of the fabrics and this edge and this end. I'm placing the pins perpendicular to the edge so that when I sew, I can sew over the pins. And then try and find the centre snip and match that. And then find the quarter markings and match those. And now you've got those markers all in position, just spend a little time distributing the gathering evenly between your markers, bunching up the fabric again if you need to, if you've undone the gathers too much, and then pop a few more pins in if you need to. Once you've distributed the gathering and you're happy with it, we're going to sew it in place. Remember to turn your stitch length back down to a regular length stitch before you start. So I'll turn mine down to 2.5. The seam allowance for my project is 15mm, 1.5 cm, or 5/8 of an inch. So I'm going to be using this marking to sew my seam. So position the fabric under the presser foot with the raw edges matching the 1.5 cm line, and take a few stitches to back tack. And then once you're ready, stitch over the gathers all the way to the end of the fabric. By stitching from the gathering side, you can make sure that you're not creating any pleats or large tucks, and you can do a little bit of extra distribution as you sew. You want to make sure that your stitching line sits to the left of the gathering stitches. So even if you have to make your seam allowance fractionally bigger in places, that will be okay. And then once you've finished, pull the threads out and then cut those threads. Now you've finished stitching, you can take all the pins out. Then check from the other side and take a look at your stitches. You should see that there's no visible stitch line. There's no gathering stitching showing from the right side. And the gathering is really evenly distributed. I don't have any kind of areas where there's no gathering or areas where there's loads of gathering. It's nice and even all the way along. So once you're happy and you feel you don't need to do any more altering to that, cut off the gathering threads . And then you can edge finish this edge with an overlocker or zigzag or however you normally edge finish, and press the seam allowance towards the smaller piece of fabric. And then turn it over and press again from the right side, making sure that sits nice and flat all the way along. If you do have any areas where you can see your stitches, where you can see the gathering, you can always pull these out afterwards.